3 weeks earlier, when I first arrived at Lod Airport in Tel Aviv, the female customs officer in army uniform was very officious. She didn't smile and she seemed so angry. So it wasn't exactly a welcoming experience. I was also body searched, and everything in my backpack and my other bag was taken out and inspected. My bar of soap was cut open and my travelling clock taken apart. For what? Drugs? Or a bomb? I suppose it was to be expected, since there'd been a terrorist attack at the airport a few months earlier, killing 26 people and injuring 80 others. Now, on my return to the airport, en route to Athens and then Stuttgart, I was given a similar treatment. Another female customs officer, also in army uniform, or it could have been the same one, was not happy that I was transporting coffee and pastries to Germany. And as she poked around in the sticky baklava and the strong-smelling coffee, said, "Why are you carrying these? This is ridiculous. They have them in Germany." Fortunately, she didn't confiscate them, although as time went on and the smell of coffee lost its appeal and the pastries became stickier in the hot sun, I wish she had taken them away. Actually, the amount of pastries had diminished considerably by the time I finally handed them over to Eddie in Stuttgart. Chris, my friend from Coventry, was waiting for me at the American Express office in Athens, as we'd arranged, and after I'd picked up my mail, we decided we'd try and hitch a ride to Germany, both of us being quite low on funds. Luckily, we met a group of Dutch hippies who were travelling as far as Austria in a bright yellow Volkswagen van plastered with all kinds of peace stickers, naturally. And anyway, they said we could join them. They called themselves Shitty Tours, so we weren't sure what we'd let ourselves in for. But the 3 young men and 2 women were great fun. We had a lot of laughs as we exchanged travel stories. It was getting late when we arrived in Yugoslavia, and the driver of the van started looking for a place to park for the night. He decided to park under a bridge on a main highway. Since there wasn't room for me and Chris to sleep in the van, we contemplated sleeping on the side of the road, next to the van. However, a nearby field seemed a quieter and possibly safer prospect to lay our heads. As the 2 couples slept in the van, the spare guy, Luke, joined us in the field to protect us girls in case there were any werewolves in that part of the world, he said. I had my sturdy US Army sleeping bag, and Luke also had a sleeping bag, but poor Chris only had a beach towel to sleep on. Fortunately, there were a couple of extra blankets available in the van, so she wrapped herself in those. But she never complained. She told me later that she was cold and hardly slept a wink. It actually took us all a while to settle in under a beautiful starlit sky. And Luke made us laugh when he said, "Will someone please turn out the lights?" I woke up feeling the bright morning sun on my face and was shocked to see a farmer with a pitchfork and his young son standing over the 3 of us, not looking too pleased that we'd apparently trespassed on his property. Neither the farmer nor the boy said a word. They just stood there with these weird expressions on their faces. I suppose they were trying to figure out who we were. We quickly got up, apologising profusely for being in his scratchy cornfield, and gathered our things before the farmer chased us away with his pitchfork. Well, he might have done that, I'm not sure. He looked as though he was ready to do it anyway. When we arrived in Dubrovnik, we decided to look around, go to the toilet, and get something to eat. We found a small, cheap cafe where we took it in turns to visit the facilities, which turned out to be a disgusting toilet. It was filthy. I'm sure you're all tired of listening about my toilet experiences, And I promise there are no more nasty ones to come. Thank goodness for that, I'm sure you're saying. It is interesting, though, that when sharing travel information with fellow travellers, the subject of toilets always comes up, from the worst to the best. So far, we hadn't encountered the best, but thankfully it was to come. After we'd eaten a very unimpressive bowl of watery vegetable soup, we wandered around Dubrovnik and were impressed by the beauty of the place. It was really lovely. We'd like to have explored a bit more of the city, but we all vowed to return one day. I've yet to go back there. A few hours later, the VW van dropped Chris and I off at the train station in Vienna. We sadly said goodbye and thanked our lovely Dutch travel companions for letting us share their journey. They were encouraging us to go all the way with them to Amsterdam, but unfortunately, I had a commitment with a lawyer in Stuttgart. Before buying our train tickets to Stuttgart, we were both in desperate need of, you've guessed it, the toilet. We stopped at the ticket office for directions and saw that a television was on behind the ticket sellers, which they were all looking at, and we thought it was a bit unusual. There was also a TV on in the waiting room that people seemed glued to. We really didn't pay much attention since we were anxious to go. We couldn't believe our eyes when we entered the pink-tiled and immaculate bathroom. It practically sparkled with cleanliness. There was soap and clean cloth towels and, best of all, toilet rolls. Yes, this was definitely the best. As we stood at the ticket counter, we looked at the TV and were shocked at what we saw. There were awful images from the Munich Olympic Games. Palestinian terrorists in masks attacking Israeli athletes in the Olympic Village. These images belonged in a movie, but this was real and being broadcast all over the world more or less as it happened. It was horrendous to see, and to know that such hatred and violence had penetrated the Olympic Games in the very country where the murder of 6 million Jews had taken place 3 decades earlier. As I reflected on my recent time in Israel and the wonderful people I'd met, I prayed that a peaceful resolution between the Arabs and Jews could one day be possible, and that they eventually would be able to live side by side in love and harmony. That is what I wish for everyone. But I'm an idealist. I was happy to be returning to the 5th General Hospital and was very grateful that Chris and I had been offered accommodation in the BOQ, Bachelor Officers' Quarters, where I'd previously lived. I enjoyed introducing Chris to my friends, and she was soon one of the gang. Of course, it was great seeing Dave, who was on the short list to return to Indiana. Yes, he was short, and he couldn't wait to go back to the world. He again pleaded with me to join him. Maybe one day, I said. In the meantime, I had to meet with one of the lawyers assigned to the Billy Sutton murder case, who Dave said was an okay guy. The meeting went well. I can't remember all the details, but basically I could only tell the truth about my experiences with Carter. He was not a very nice person, to say the least, and it was pretty clear from all the evidence that he had murdered Billy Sutton and did so many other terrible things. I was very happy and relieved to know from the lawyer that Carter was behind bars back in the States. Not quite the world he envisaged, I'm sure. I was also relieved to meet Eddie, or Khalid, at a park in Stuttgart and hand over the loose coffee and what was left of the baklava. He agreed with the Lod Airport customs officer that it was ridiculous his mother had sent these to him, but he was grateful for her thoughtfulness. He hugged me then and started crying. Apparently, he'd received a letter from Mohammed telling him the whole story of his younger brother, Joseph, and the consequences to the family because of his alleged actions. Then he heard the sad news that Joseph had died in prison. Eddie was inconsolable and very angry that his family had kept this from him. But they wanted Eddie to have a good life and to be free, Mohammed had told me. I have to go home, Eddie said. I have to go home. Chris and I returned to Coventry at the end of September, and neither of us was very happy about being back at home, apart from seeing family and friends, of course. So we decided pretty quickly that we wanted to save enough money to go back to Greece as soon as possible. Chris was a hairdresser, but didn't really want to go back to cutting hair. I'd been a legal secretary and was told by the small family company where I'd worked for 6 years that the door was always open. But like Chris, I had no desire to go back. We both needed something and somewhere different. We wanted to keep moving forward. Chris had previously spent time working in Brighton, a seaside resort not far from London, for the non-Brits listening to this, and had stayed in touch with a boyfriend, Tim, who was now working as a blackjack dealer at the Playboy Club in London. He trained at Sergeant York Casino in Brighton and told us they were looking for croupiers to deal American roulette. He said if we were interested, he'd put in a word for us. We didn't know the first thing about roulette, but we'd been looking for something different, and this seemed to be it. Within a few weeks, we'd found a flat in a family home in Brighton and went along to Sergeant York Casino to be interviewed. The casino was next to the Brighton railway station, and although large, was quite a subtle building. No flashing lights are welcome there. Although not exactly Caesar's palace, it was quite tasteful inside, if one could describe a casino that way. I'd never actually been in a casino before and thought it was going to be shabby and sleazy. In fact, both Chris and I were surprised at the warmth of the decor, perhaps deliberate to lull gamblers into a false sense of security. There were around 8 roulette tables and several blackjack tables on the main floor. A private area for high rollers to play chemin de fer or baccarat, as well as craps, was almost hidden away on another level. There was a decent restaurant and a bar, of course. Pretty young waitresses were dressed in sexy versions of the US Army uniform worn by Sergeant Alvin York, who was the most decorated American soldier of World War I, even though he had a casino named after him, which I'm sure didn't eclipse his Medal of Honor. I don't think he would have approved of the waitresses' miniskirts and the plunging necklines of their faux army jackets covering bare flesh. However, the casino customers definitely liked the way the girls were dressed and rewarded them accordingly by slipping gambling chips between their bosoms. In contrast, croupiers, the majority of whom were men, wore black tuxedos and white shirts, but just in case the dealers felt like making a little money on the side, all of their pockets were sewn up, preventing any surreptitious chip activity. Chris and I were interviewed by the manager of Pleasurama Casinos, the company which owned Sergeant York's, and which sounded a bit like a company specialising in porn, Pleasurama. Then we were given paperwork to complete. The questions seemed ridiculous, and we felt as if we'd have to surrender our firstborn child if we ever violated any of the rules. Chris recently reminded me that there was a question asking if we had any affiliation with the mafia. I wonder what would have happened if we'd said yes. And I can't imagine which mafia they meant. Well, since there were a lot of Greek restaurants in Brighton and we just returned from Greece, maybe they were referring to the Greek mafia. An interesting question, though, and we were intrigued why it was even asked. Anyway, we managed to pass the third degree and were accepted as trainee croupiers in American roulette. Our training took place in the afternoons at the casino when the punters were mostly bored, middle-aged and older ladies who lunch types with plenty of money and a gambling habit. In our initial briefing, before we even got to the roulette table, we were told that we couldn't speak to the customers. There wouldn't be any niceties at all. "They're not your friends," our male instructor Woody told us. "Those sweet little old ladies will try to take advantage of your vulnerability," he said. "Don't let it happen," he said strongly. Chain-smoking Woody, who was probably in his 30s, was tough on us. And maybe that was because we were among a handful of girls working as croupiers. He definitely had a superior attitude and was, without a doubt, a misogynist. He constantly put us down and seemed to delight in making us feel stupid. Woody was born and bred in London, where most of the dealers seemed to come from. He called us, "You gals from the north," in his broad Cockney accent, which I can't really do. "We're from the Midlands," I'd tell him. "Same thing," he'd respond. The first thing Chris and I learned was chipping, which meant picking up 100 individual gambling chips from the table with the tips of our fingers on both hands. This was so we could become familiar with the feel of the chips and know when we had a stack of 20 chips in each hand by the feel. We couldn't count. We had to do it as exact as possible. And I wasn't very good at all. I was clumsy, kept dropping the chips. I just didn't have the nimble fingers and speed that Chris had. She was great and far more dexterous than me. She soon had her stacks of chips ready, almost while I was thinking about it. Of course, Woody didn't fail to give me a hard time about that. Once we got the hang of chipping and cutting the stacks with the fingers of both hands and gliding the chips towards the customer, then it was spinning the ball in the roulette wheel. Fortunately, it didn't jump out onto the floor too often. Calculating the amount of the winning bet was challenging, but we learnt a process of picture bets, which made it easier. For instance, chips in the square surrounding the number on the splits and the corners would be called a frame and add up to 76. If a chip was on the number in the middle, worth 35, then the total would be 111. There were several variations of picture designs with sometimes 3 or 4 chips on the number, splits and corners. So it's just a matter of recognising the total of those pictures and adding or subtracting where necessary. I know it sounds a bit complicated and it's hard to describe, but it was actually pretty straightforward. And fortunately, to my surprise, this seemed to be my forte. It was of ultimate importance to keep the game moving, and everything had to be done at top speed. We also had to adapt to right-handed and left-handed tables, switching from one to another regularly so that each hand was equally able to spin the roulette ball and handle the chips and money. After a couple of weeks, after we'd received certificates of approval from the Gaming Board of Great Britain, it was determined that we were ready to face the punters. We wore white high-neck blouses and long black skirts, and just like the men, our pockets had to be sewn closed, if we had pockets, obviously. So even though it would have been impossible to steal gambling chips, we weren't allowed to accept tips either. Consequently, the waitresses made a great deal more money than the croupiers. Chris and I were each assigned a roulette table, and an inspector sat on a high chair at the top of the table watching the croupier's every move. I got the dreaded Woody. There was also an eye-in-the-sky camera. We weren't allowed to handle money from a customer. It was placed on a wooden paddle, which we pulled forward and then slid the money into a slot in the table. That was a feat by itself. We always had to announce the amount of money going into the slot, saying, for instance, £5 going down, before we manoeuvred the stacks of chips with, hopefully, an elegant two-handed motion over to the customer. The rule at that time was croupiers worked 20 minutes on a table and 20 minutes off because of the intensity of the work, I think, and the focus. And Chris and I were very relieved when we'd completed our first 20 minutes and could relax in the staff room with a sandwich and a cup of tea. Next time, manipulative, nice ladies and changing the rules of the game. I hope you'll keep listening.